Okay. Okay, so we're talking about, we're going to start in on the history of graphic design. I asked you to watch a video from Sean Adams, who is a history of graphic design instructor at the Art Center, and then also to read the material that kind of follows along with his talk. And he starts pretty much at the turn of the century, the Industrial Revolution. We can go back as far as, you know, the origins of writing and cave paintings and, you know, all of that. But rather than spend time with that, I thought I would spend a huge chunk kind of like in the middle. Yeah, I'm starting to do the Trump thing now. And I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on typography, because typography is something that's the evolution of typography, which in a sense is the core of graphic design. If we look at graphic design as communication, communicating a message, both you know, with words and images, and now with moving images and sound and all of that in media, then we have to look at, you know, if we go back in history, the most powerful tool in all of that was the written word. And obviously it all started with, you know, scribes and, you know, like illuminated manuscripts, which we're really not going to cover in this particular course, although it's a very interesting part of graphic design history, is how the scribes took quills and inked and, you know, sat in a room for weeks on end and wrote, because that was the only way information could be put down on paper. And if you had a number of copies that you needed to do, you'd have to have a number of scribes writing each copy. So that was just incredibly time consuming, but that was the only way. But really at the turn of the century is when kind of in the Industrial Revolution, not just in graphic design, but all over the world and in machinery and the invention of machines, graphic design followed in the sense of being able to produce messages, posters, typography, illustration, photography in a very mechanized way, where it was efficient, it was much more efficient, and multiple copies were being able to be put out. Thus, information was being able to be widespread in the world. And it's really kind of more of the interesting part of the graphic design history. And I'll probably take it all the way up to maybe the computer era, where we started doing things digitally. And from that point on, you're living it. So I don't know if we have to really cover that, because that's part of what you're living currently. But before we go into the areas that were covered in the video and the reading, we still need to talk about, and I'm not going to talk about this in depth at all, I'm just going to mention it, the fact of the first forms of printing. And the first forms of printing, if you look back in this book, I don't know if you did or not, but if you look back in the earlier chapters, it talks about the origins of writing, and then the first origins of printing, which were actually documented as being in China. This would be happening in, let's say, all the way as early as the 3rd century CE. So we're talking, you know, long ago. And the first origins of printing were actually stamps. Kind of think of what rubber stamps are today. They were carved out of wood, they were inked, and they were stamped. And there was no paper at that time. So they were stamped on things like leaves and plants. Bamboo was a surface that they used to stamp on. Wood they would stamp on. And those are how crude, you know, communications were, were printed, actually printed, as opposed to written by hand. And then paper came along. Paper came along, say, in the later. If you look in the book, they document that as, say, 105 CE. Again, an invention of the Chinese. Not going to go into the process of making paper, but it was made by hand. It was hung to dry, and now they had a surface that they were able to, to print on. And it was also used for many other things. The invention of paper not only was for printing, but it was for, everything from wrapping things to, all the uses of paper down to even toilet paper. So those are some of the uses of that in the early days. And then we're going to fast forward to the 1400s. And where probably the next major thing was created, and that was the Guttenberg Press. And the Guttenberg Press was a method of setting type to the point where it was called movable type, where you can set type in a matrix. And the beauty of that was that you were able to make multiple copies of a document without it being written each time by scribes. So what that did was, that was revolutionary in being able to get much more information out to, to the world, and to make multiple copies of, of a document. And thus the Gutenberg Bible was printed, and there's actually a Gutenberg Bible in the
Huntington Library.
Huntington Library, yes. Mm-hmm. So another major milestone when it comes to printing and the written message. And then we again fast forward to the point that we're going to start kind of today. How you doing, Chris?
Doing all right.
Good.
Sorry about that. I had internet issues.
Yeah. Well, we're just getting started. Let you know where we are recording this session. I'm recording it for Daniel so that he can view it, and I don't have to talk about this all over again. So where we start is kind of the innovations of typography. And I was telling Lauren that that's what I'm going to kind of emphasize a lot in this history of graphic design, is a lot of typography in the beginning, the innovations of it. And I don't know, this is, in fact, this entire class is pretty much meant for your, just understanding of where all of this comes from, where graphic design comes from, typefaces, illustration, photography, why we used it, what were the first uses of it, and so forth. And you'll see how crude it actually was in the beginnings. And so, believe it or not, many of the fonts that we use today are fonts that were originally, original fonts. And I'm going to share my screen for a sec and just go to the text that we read. I'm going to go to the book here. And I'm going to go up to the innovations of typography. And as you read through this, which I'm sure all of you did, we see, names like Robert Thorne, Figgins, Jackson, Caslon. You might be familiar with Caslon. Caslon is a typeface that is very popular, a very traditional typeface. If we look at most of these typefaces, though, we can see that they're serif-based. These are what are called slab serifs, but they're all serif-based fonts. And one of the reasons for serif-based fonts was because of the architectural design of Roman architecture. Roman and Greek architecture, right? You can think of these as columns, the old Roman and Greek columns. And as the column came down, you know, you had all the different types of column capitals, you know, Dorian and Ionic, and, you know, if you study art history. But typography kind of followed the same design of that. So we see a lot of kind of slab serif fonts in the early days. We also see definitely serif typefaces. And then it goes into wood type posters, and, you know, these are the things that we see in the Old West, you know, in the 1800s, you know, wood posters, wanted, dead or alive. We see this type of, you know, old woodcut type style. And did you guys watch the video from Sean Adams up to at least 15 minutes of that? Because he kind of talks about, you know, a lot of this and shows really good examples. Here's a really good example here of this, you know, old kind of woodcut look. So Castellan is, you know, Castellan and Baskerville. Another one of the styles in the early days before the Industrial Revolution was this heavy emphasis on typography. In fact, typography is the only method of getting out communications. There was no real way to put down illustration, definitely not photography yet. There was no way to reproduce photography. Soon in the early days of photography, there were ways to capture images and print them on you know, kind of metal and silver oxide plates. But up until then, it was just words. And so in order to grab attention, and that is still the main goal of advertising and, you know, signage, is to get your attention, right? There was a myriad of ways of you know, if you notice a lot of these old posters, these typographic posters, they have different typefaces in just about every line. And there were a lot of liberties in changing typography, changing the size of type. Look at this. I mean, you know, this is exactly what we teach you not to do in graphic design, is fill your page with, you know, 15 different typefaces. But that was actually the goal back then, is to do that. And the reason is mainly for excitement and attention grabbing, you know, methods and goals. So anyway, you know, we get into this section here, which is now the mechanization of typography. And in order to really appreciate this, and I want to show you guys a short video on this that is very relevant. I think it's very relevant and interesting. You didn't by any chance see that movie with Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep on the Washington Post? It was called The Post. Did you ever see that movie?
No.
I heard it was good.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I've just never seen it.
Yeah, it was about the Pentagon Papers. But anyway, in that movie, because they worked at the Washington Post back in the 60s, they were still using Linotype to typeset typography for newspapers. And if you're not, you know, if you're not versed in Linotype and what Linotype is, I want to show you a very short video on how that was done. And it's just amazing. But before I show that video, we have to understand how type was actually created. So we had the Guttenberg Press, right? And they're setting type now letter for letter, metal type, okay, in a matrix. A matrix is just a form, okay? And they're metal slugs, and letter for letter, spelling out words, line for line, okay? You know the term leading, right? In typography, you have point size, and underneath that you have leading. You know what leading is? You know why they call it leading?
It was made out of lead.
Yes, but what does leading do? No, you're correct. It's lead. You're half correct, okay?
Yeah.
But leading is, what is leading? When you go to InDesign or you go to Photoshop and you set 12-point type, but you make the leading 14 points, what are you doing?
Isn't that the distance between the sentences, like the lines? Isn't that the distance between those?
That's absolutely correct, right? And so if you, I'm just gonna sketch out. Okay, I don't know if you can see this. I'm gonna hold it up to my thing here, okay? Now, the top R, think of that as a metal slug of type, okay? Remember the old typewriters where the key used to smash the paper, okay?
Yeah.
Now, the next line, let's say, is represented by the letter S. That's the next line of type. Now, you see that space in between the R and the S? That's a slug of metal, and that's what we call lead. Now, the thickness of that slug determines how wide the spacing is from line to line. So the more lead you use, the more your lines start spacing out. So 12 over 15 means that this piece of lead right here is 3 points. You have 12 points plus 3 equals a total of 15 points total, but 3 points of lead in between. So that's what leading is. Leading is just simply the lead that is put between two lines of text in the old way of setting type in a matrix. The point I want to make, though, in all of this is that that's the way they used to have to set type. Now imagine how long it would take to set letter for letter, line for line, type, okay? But once it was set in this matrix, then the matrix was put on a press, a letter press, what's called the letter press, and it was inked, and then it was transferred to paper, and that's going to be in the video that I showed you. So in this era of graphic design history, okay, the mechanization of type, which happened around 1854, not that that is important, but just to give you an idea of when that happened. It was invented by Merganthaler, Ottmar Merganthaler, and he invented the Linotype machine, okay? Now the Linotype machine was actually a keyboard, like a typewriter, an old-fashioned typewriter, and you'd punch in the letter, and it would cast that letter in metal and send it up on a line, and that whole line would be cast in metal, and you would be setting lines of type now instead of letter for letter. Let me show you this quick video, and it's about 5 minutes long, but really relevant to this idea of linotype and the way type was done. Now this was set, it was set this way all the way up to the 1960s, okay? So imagine that, okay? Linotype was a huge form of setting typography and lasted for a very long time. I'm going to turn my microphone to the speaker of this computer so you can hear this, and tell me, I'm going to ask you if you can hear this okay.
Okay.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll put it full screen.
The linotype, once known as the eighth wonder of the world, was invented by Ottmar Merganthaler in 1866. Merganthaler revolutionized the printing industry by eliminating the slow process of setting type by hand. This machine produced lines of type, drastically decreasing the amount of time it took to create a printed piece. For nearly a century, the linotype was the print standard for magazines, posters, and newspapers. The process of creating a line of type begins with an alloy of metals being heated to over 500 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, so in the linotype process, you are actually casting metal slugs. So this machine is actually heating metal to cast into the letters that you're sending it through the keyboard. That's pretty amazing. So,
Yeah.
so you're, as a typesetter, not only are you setting type, but you're also maintaining this machine that deals with, you know, molten metal and poisonous gas.
Jeez.
Linotype operator Daniel Williams sets type at the machine's 90-character keyboard. The keystrokes release a matrix, which is a single character of a particular typeface. Matrices are stored in the magazine section, which creates a channel for the mats to flow down once released by the operator's keyboard. Matrices then drop down into the assembly from the magazine, where a rail holds the mats into place with a jaw to set the desired line width.
Okay, now also remember that each line of type that's being set has to be figured out as far as its line length. So that's what that last part is.
After casting, mats are moved to a second elevator and lifted to the distributor at the top of the magazine. Matrices are then returned to their designated spot in the magazine.
Okay, so there's this big arm right here. And, you know, first of all, it's called linotype because you're setting line for line rather than letter for letter like you used to. Okay, so it's, in that sense, it's really saving a lot of time. Each time you set a line, this picks it up and sends it up to an elevator, which actually moves this line around, you know, in the matrix. Okay.
When the line is full, the operator presses a casting lever, sending the matrices to the casting section. The operator can now begin the next line of type. The casting process is automatic and set into motion once the operator releases the line from the assembler. This is where the type slugs or lines of type are produced.
Wow.
Okay, so each line is represented by a type slug. And if there's leading involved later on, they'll put a slug of lead in between these lines to space them out. But the thickness of the slug, it can be controlled too. This is just amazing the way this works.
Yeah.
Very time consuming though.
Mm-hmm.
After the type slugs are finished, the operator will head to the letterpress room for printing. To create the printed document, the lines of type are placed into a chase or frame. Wood blocking, known as furniture, is inserted around the type to hold the type in place. Once the type is set, the frame is tightened and locked into the bed of the press.
Okay, so this has been kind of thought of as a matrix or a frame. They call these wooden pieces furniture, which allow this section. This might be an invitation. It might be, you know, a block of copy to a single card or something. but it, you know, is tightened up and then it's put in and set into the letterpress.
The ink
Have you seen the movie? Have you ever seen that movie with Will Smith about how he's dying of cancer and he, you know, at the end he gets in a bathtub with a poisonous fish and he kills himself, but he has this girlfriend that has a letterpress printer in her garage that he fixes for her. This is called the letterpress printer. And this is how things were printed before we had offset litho. And it's an art. I mean, people that know how to use this press. This plate right here, down here, is where the matrix is put in. And this is the ink roller up here. You'll see how it works in a second.
already applied to the press is transferred to the type in the form and pressed into the paper. The finished piece must be laid out to let dry.
Okay, so as this came up, you saw the ink roller go through the in there. Let me roll that back for a sec.
Let dry.
Okay, there's the matrix right here. Ink hits it, it's smashed up against the paper, and then they take the paper out.
Linotype was a significant improvement over manual letter-by-letter typesetting.
So if you had 100 copies, you'd have to feed in 100 sheets of paper and press it and pull it out and pull out the paper each time. So this was done through your feet. On a bigger letterpress press, it's done through pedals, and you pump it like a bicycle. And all you're doing is putting in the paper, it hits it, you're pulling out the paper, putting in the paper, pulling out the paper. And that's all you do all day long. For 500 copies, you got to do it 500 times, actually 1,000 times, because you're putting it in once and taking it out once. So it's twice per sheet. I know, Chris, you work in the printing industry, so, you know, this is archaic compared to the way it's done now, digitally.
That's true.
But from here, what we did was, what the printing industry did, was it went to what's called offset lithography, okay, or litho, offset litho. And we were using offset litho, we still do today, but not as much as, you know, let's say from the late 60s, early 70s, all the way up to the millennium, offset litho was the method of printing.
It created a faster production time using less workers. It dramatically increased production of printed materials. The machine revolutionized typesetting and newspaper publishing, making it possible for a small number of operators to set type for many pages on a daily basis. Linotype was the printing standard from the late 1800s to the 1970s.
1970s, late 1800s to the 1970s. That's a long time that we used this form of typesetting. And yet today, this, you know, the quality of this is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. In fact, there's a slight impression that you get in the type itself. And, you know, really expensive invitations, wedding invitations, and things like celebrities, you know, when they get married, and politicians and all of that, that they want their invitations on a on a letterpress, printed on letterpress. And not too many printing companies do letterpress anymore. But I don't know if you've ever seen letterpress printing, but it is just absolutely gorgeous. And you can print on some really high quality paper too, because each sheet is being fed in separately. So you don't have paper kind of restrictions in that. But yeah, that printing style of Linotype is, or letterpress
Until it
is
was
really.
largely replaced by offset lithography, printing, and computer typesetting.
Okay, so that's all I wanted to show you with that. So that is, I'm sorry, let me go back to my share screen here and get back on this right here. Okay, so Sean Adams in his video kind of talks about the early days of not necessarily printing, but kind of poster design, and how lots of communication were these posters that were hung. And again, the Guttenberg Press allowed multiple posters to be printed. Once you had the matrix all set up, it was just a matter of printing off as many copies as you could. So wanted dead or alive posters, they were able to distribute out to all the towns in the West, and so forth. Advertising became a big form of of printing. Everyone started getting on the advertising bandwagon because they had material now that they could print and that they could sell their goods. It's not just word of mouth anymore. So graphics really played a huge role in the the development of the industrialized world. He then goes on to, he touches upon, illuminated manuscripts as being the way before Gutenberg to, obtain printed material, and how scribes would, write these things out. It would take, eons to get copies of books, manuscripts. Oh, and then they would do gold foiling. Have you ever seen gold foiling? That's just amazing, that process of gold foiling. And then he talks about, the advent of the, Merganthaler, and the ability to create, a Linotype machine. Actually, this is before. See all these little trays right here? These are all slugs of words or letters, whatever. And, we still use that term uppercase and lowercase. Do you ever, actually the term that we really use is caps and lowercase. And we use that term pretty, pretty frequently when we talk about typography. We still do. It's funny that our terminology of typography is still very ancient. We don't do any of that anymore. But do you know what uppercase and lowercase is by any chance? You ever know where that term came from?
Nope.
Uppercase, lowercase. It came from case drawers. And if you went into an old printer, you would see case drawers. And above the waist, all of the drawers above the waist were considered the uppercase drawers. And each case drawer, when you pulled it out, looked like this. They were divided up into little boxes of slugs of type. You'd have the A's and the B's, and sometimes you'd have words set, like the, is, very common things that you would use. But a lot of times you had to spell it out letter for letter. But the case drawers were the uppercase above your waist were all the capital letters, and the case drawers below your waist were all the lowercase letters, small letters. So that's where uppercase and lowercase come from. And just kind of interesting that we still use that today. We don't say small letters or large letters. I mean, you might when you're in, second grade or kindergarten. But the way we refer to it is caps and lowercase. I'm not sure where the word caps, when it replaced uppercase, but anyway, that's just kind of FYI trivia there. Yeah, and then he kind of makes mention of how large letters were actually very difficult to hold in metal. They would crack, they would break. And so a lot of times they would use large letters and they would carve them out of wood. So imagine that. If you wanted a big headline, they would carve it out of wood, and they would do the same thing. They would incorporate it with metal type, but wood tended to hold, you know, when they squeezed that matrix, it wouldn't crack like metal would. But anyway, lots to do with typography. One of the things we were talking about is the myriad of typefaces that they used to use in one design. And, you know, it's funny, when you first learn of something, any new technology or something, you always tend to want to use everything. You know, I know in music, whenever we create a song, we're always throwing everything into it. You know, it's like, oh, I wonder what this sounds like with that. You know, let's throw some congas, let's throw some maracas, let's do, you know, let's put more percussion in, let's try this, let's try violins and strings and all that stuff. And usually what ends up happening is the more you add to something, the more confusing and chaotic it becomes. So what in music, what we ending up doing is starting to take out stuff. And so that's why, if ever you wanted to know, why is it that design teachers are always telling you to limit the amount of type styles in your design? Okay, well, because we've already been there, and we've been there a long time ago, and we realized that it just made the communication much more difficult to understand when you pack your page with, you know, so many different typefaces. So now things are a lot more kind of streamlined and easier to understand. And, you know, I guess the rule of thumb has always been, you know, maybe 2 or 3 typefaces at most. Headlines could be different than body copy, but don't start adding different fonts to every line. Okay, but they did that before for excitement, and we were talking a little bit about that. Here he talks about how graphic design or letterpress printing is still being used today, even in 2020. And there's this, not just because of, you know, this retro feel, but because it's just really clean and it's really classy. And so if ever you want a really classy piece printed, get it printed off a letterpress. Okay, this is an interesting part of the video where he starts talking about poster design. And this was happening kind of at the turn of the century in Europe. And what we were getting from this, what we got from this is a lot of layout and typography ideas from the Europeans and how they used illustration. And I just want to play a little bit of this here.
And is considered the father of the modern poster. He moved away from type-only solutions and introduced illustrations and a more painterly approach. The images convey a sense of frivolity and fun. He used exaggerated lighting and energetic movement to communicate excitement and pleasure. Many of the posters use a strong X-axis to maintain harmony. The colors are carefully chosen to give the illusion of artificial or stage lighting. For example, a Sarah Bernhardt poster uses blue on her face to simulate a stage-lit shadow.
I want to point out one thing that we see a lot way back when, and that is this use of large caps with smaller letters. Notice how the caps are dropping. Notice how the caps drop in the letter P. The S is larger than everything else. Okay, we still see that today, and that kind of conveys, you know, a much more classic and older feel in design. So whenever you use that style, now you kind of know where that came from. It came from a lot of poster design. We see that in a lot of design from way back when, you know, even those previous examples I just showed, where, you know, the last letter of a word is dropped. It's larger, some, you know, things like that. And you can see the old typographic design. Again, lots of serif typefaces. Sans serif really hasn't made its way into use yet, quite yet.
And Charest integrated the typography into the image with hand-drawn and painted letter forms. Charest presented women in a new and modern way. Previous depictions in posters and art were of prostitutes or holy figures. His women were called charettes and showed the new attitudes. Women in Paris in the 1890s had a less restrictive role. Charette showed this with lower cut dresses, smoking, energetic dancing, and even operating new machines like an electric lamp. In the same time period, the flat forms and simplicity of Japanese woodblock prints influenced Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. He took Charette's approach of an image-based poster, but moved toward a flatter and simpler form.
Another thing that we're seeing in terms of, lots of colorful illustrations, a lot of creativity, emphasis on creativity and illustration back in this time. We'll see the same thing with Art Deco, with the Art Deco movement. But notice how the typography is also reflecting this idea of, I don't want to say a rebellion against traditional typography, but a lot of hand lettered stuff, along with this, which, in a lot of these posters that he's showing, hand lettered typography, which is interesting, in itself.
His posters also use theatrical lighting and dynamic movement to create excitement for the entertainment events he promoted. Lautrec's posters integrated the typography as well, but the style was less refined than Charette's, following a looser approach. Lautrec also used large expanses of negative space and implied form, as Japanese woodblock prints did. He doesn't paint the detail of May Milton's dress. We are only shown a large area of white. The viewer is forced to fill in the blanks to complete the elements in his or her head. Other artists, such as Théophile Alexandre Steinlein, shared Lautrec's passion for Japanese woodblock art and Impressionism. His poster, the Chat Noir, mixes the solid shapes and high contrast of Lautrec's work with a tighter and less fluid form.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm stopping it so often, but I want to make comments as we go through this. Another thing that we're seeing I think one of the universal things that we're seeing in a lot of this is this idea of large imagery. You can see that as a common theme in these posters, where illustration becomes very large and prominent in the poster, and typography is kind of complementing it, whether it's going across the top, whether it's going down the bottom, or whether it's wrapping around the object. We're seeing a lot of type wraps in these posters. Obviously hand lettered, kind of type run amok, if you will, in this, but also the integration of typography with imagery, whether it's overlapping, whether images are going through letters, and so forth. So we have this, dynamic kind of thing happening with the layout itself and how illustration and typography are working together.
While Alexandre Steinlein shared Lautrec's passion for Japanese woodblock art and Impressionism. His poster, the Chat,
Let me go here.
in addition to Oscar Wilde's Salome, Beardsley created a series of illustrations for Sir Thomas Malory's book, The Death of Arthur. These illustrations became Beardsley's best-known work. The subject matter is an idealized medieval Camelot. Beardsley begins to incorporate harder edge borders and elements from illuminated manuscripts. Alphonse Mucha's posters and illustrations for advertising share Beardsley's fluid forms and idealized romantic past.
Okay, so now we're getting into kind of this Art Deco feel, and I don't know about you, but just beautiful stuff. I mean, to me, this is like, so much detail, lots of color. This is more kind of Renaissance style, depictions of imagery, especially women, more realistic type illustration, highly detailed, stained glass, the whole Art Deco feel. And it's just, a wonderful time of art, in my opinion.
Mucha, however, incorporated color and complex pattern. Many of these illustrations were intended for large-scale posters rather than small books. At small scale, These may seem less dramatic than Beardsley's high contrast, but at actual poster size, the effect is hypnotic. Mucha used Arabic and Byzantine decorative motifs for the
Look at the design of this, the symmetry of this. We have a very symmetrical, and yet we have this movement that's happening in here, the twisting of the garments, and but the symmetry of the typography. You can put a line straight down the middle and you can see that mirrored image of what's happening. But again, that Art Deco style, shapes behind the image. Just I really, have always loved this style.
patterns, borders, and typography. Like Beardsley's connection to Camelot, Mucha uses these foreign forms to comment on the goodness of a more agrarian culture with handmade design. Incredibly, we are in the midst of a similar reaction today, this time with the digital and technological. Again, we see a movement towards organic forms, handmade production, and an idealized reverence for pattern. For a designer who has known nothing but the computer screen, this seems like a radical and new idea. It would be simpler if I stayed.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it here at the arts and crafts movement. We're going to talk about next the arts and crafts movement and Art Deco a little bit. And I will put up the reading assignments. I'm going to I'll put up the reading assignments on the next assignment. So I'll have that, and I'll give you what slice of this video that I would like you to watch. We're going to watch this video throughout the module. So it'll be just little slices of video that relate to the reading. The reading for the next section will not be as much as the first section here was, but it will cover arts and crafts and Art Deco. And then it will be very relevant to, to what we're doing today. You'll be able to understand that. But I want to talk about, after Art Deco, we're going to talk about the Bauhaus. And that's when World War II happened. And that's when I think you really relate to the Bauhaus movement, because it's very similar to what we're seeing today in design. The simplicity, the sans serif faces, furniture, modern, everything modern, simplified, minimalist. That's totally the themes of the Bauhaus that's being relived today, literally. And that should be interesting to, not only graphic design, but home design, architectural design, interior design. We're following the Bauhaus right now, almost to the T. We'll also talk about Russian constructivism, which happened before that, which kind of led up to this rebellion of traditional elitist graphics. But we'll get into all of that coming up. There's so much to cover here, and it's so, for me, it's just so exciting to dip into this stuff. But anyway, I wanted to emphasize more on the typographic. A lot of this was about typography. A lot of it was about the innovations of typography and printing, and how that played such a big part in the evolution of the communicative message of graphic design. I'm going to have a short quiz on this that I'm going to put up for this first section. It's going to be, I want you to take it by Sunday. I'll also put up the assignment, the reading assignment and the video assignment, which we will discuss next Wednesday. Okay, so Wednesdays will be our day to discuss the history of graphic design, and then Mondays will be our day to discuss commercial illustration. So if you haven't read the material or watched the video, do so by Sunday, because I'll have maybe a short 10-question quiz over this. Okay. Now, finally, to end, the assignment, I'm going to give an assignment for this class, an actual hands-on assignment. And Lauren, we were kind of talking about that in the last class.
Mhm.
I think an appropriate assignment for this. Now, this can be a portfolio piece, doesn't necessarily have to be, but there are some really good examples of timelines. And a timeline would be a very, a perfect assignment. Sorry, I've got this microphone pointed towards the screen. And let me just show you really quick an example of a graphic design timeline. And I'm just going to type in graphic design timelines. And go to images. Okay. And there was one that I really liked that I saw. It was kind of a circular thing, but let me kind of grab oh, here's one. Communication Arts magazine did a really cool graphic design timeline that they published as a poster in one of their magazines. This was back in the 80s. And you ripped it out, and we had it up on the wall at Platt College. You know, I put it up as wall art. And it was kind of, you know, the history of graphic design, and it was played out to a timeline. You can see, I don't know if you could see this clearly, but there's this little red line that goes up through 1894, and it goes all the way through here. And there's bits of information. There's, you know, photographs, there's imagery. Here's another more colorful version of the history of graphic design. Here's one that kind of goes in a circle. This one covers from 1917 all the way up to 1990, using, you know, choosing major events that happened throughout the history of graphic design. I mean, there's so much that there's, you know, it's impossible to cover all of it. Here's one that goes from just 1997 up to 2012. So, you know, a very short span of time. There was one in here that I really liked. In fact, I think it was before I went here. It was this one here. This I thought was a really cool design. And it was done in a circle, and it kind of spiraled out, and it was a typography timeline on typography. Anyway, here's what I thought is, as a kind of running project throughout this course, that you can open up, let's say, an InDesign file, and you can make this as long as you want. I mean, there is no size limitations, because this would be a totally digital piece of art. So if you wanted to make it 11 inches tall by 50 inches wide, you can do that. You can keep adding information and make this go forever if you want, because we're not printing this, so it's not something that we have to worry about fitting it into a tabloid sheet or, you know, whatever. And as we cover this information, I thought it would be nice for you to start documenting in a way, any way you want. You know, you can come up with your own design. You can grab imagery from the book if you want, or you can grab imagery from the internet that represents major parts of what you feel graphic design history, you know, the most influential parts of graphic design history. Like, based on what I would cover just on today's lecture, is I might cover things like Caslon, you know, the kind of godfather of modern, you know, typography, the origins of typography. I might definitely cover, you know, Ottmar Merganthaler and the Linotype machine. Maybe even going before all of that and briefly talking about the origins of paper and stamps and, you know, crude methods of printing, things like that. But as we go through this module to choose a few things, it doesn't have to be very complex, but things that you feel are influential in the history of graphic design. Some of the posters that we talked about, maybe Toulouse-Lautrec's poster, or as we go into the arts and crafts or Art Deco period. And that way you would have a physical piece that you could have that would document this class, where you can look at it and say, okay, now I remember, because graphic design history is one of these courses where you take it and, if you don't do anything outside of scribble down some notes, you forget everything and you have nothing to remember by. I doubt if anyone's going to dip into their graphic design book, 30 years from now and go, oh yeah, I'd like to read this again, But at least you would have a piece that, documented at least roughly some of the main points of this course. So that's not anything that's going to be due. I will have it due at the end of the module. Okay, at the very end of the module, just kind of like your illustration. So you got two kind of projects going for these courses, okay? And the two projects are going to be, the hands-on projects are going to be your illustration and then this kind of graphic design timeline. But you can do this as we go, okay? So after today's lecture, maybe you want to start it. Then we'll have the lecture next week, and then you might want to add a few things to that. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
And that would at least give you, some kind of visual and some kind of hands-on project for this course. I'm not really keen into you writing papers and essays and things like that. I mean, we're artists, and it's like we don't kind of really like doing that kind of stuff. But to create a graphic on the history of graphic design, I think that's something that we can do. Okay. Google, if you want, like I did, timelines, and you'll see very many ways to do a timeline. A lot of them are linear, where it starts at the earliest point and goes to the, latest point, the most current point. You'll see lots of timelines that are broken up into a line over time, which is what a timeline is. But there are many other ways to, skin a cat, if you will. Here's kind of a linear timeline, but it kind of, goes up and down, zigzags through different shapes, circles, squares, different shapes. Lauren, you did that website with lots of different shapes, and, this would kind of be perfect for that, possibly. There's circles and spirals you can do. I personally love that last example that I showed you, this one here. I think that's really clean with all the white space around it. I can see this as a poster. I can totally see this as a portfolio piece that can be explained, as a class that you took, and that was a project that you did. What a more appropriate project to do in a graphic design, history of graphic design class as a graphic designer. Anyway, talking too much. So anyway, that's, look for that in the assignments. And again, short quiz on Sunday. And then I guess the next time we'll meet will be Monday of next week. Okay. Do you have any questions about anything?
No questions.
Okay. Then look for the assignments and I'll put them up, and then we'll meet again on Monday. Okay. I'm going to turn this recording off here, and I will see you.